everyone, welcome. I'm François de Bloch. I'm responsible at the Ministry of European and Foreign Affairs. I'm responsible for financial governance, and I'm in charge of the mobilization of internal resources. So thank you all for being here for this webinar, which is organized by our colleagues at FERDI. I want to thank them for organizing this webinar and for the presence of all the participants. So we are here to talk about fiscal spending, which is at the heart of the mobilization of internal public resources for development. So we want to measure and publish these spendings, these funds, and this makes the choices of the state visible. It allows us to properly fund public policies and invest productively. Within the context of a French strategy to support the mobilization of internal resources, France helps several African countries in their efforts, both for the reinforcement of fiscal administration and for the improvement of the management of public spending. And so our support in this context for production and the use of reports on fiscal spending is right at the heart of what we do. It's not only about better accounting, but about better decision making. And so the question we will be asking today, and which is at the heart of this webinar, is a very precise question. What do we do once this diagnosis on public spending has been done? How can administrations use these? How can the parliament use this? How does it improve the management of internal resources? How does it improve budgetary reform? And our goal today is to share experiences to see what works, what doesn't, and how these projects can become steering tools for public policies in order to better mobilize internal resources. So thank you again for your participation. I hope you will have productive discussions. And now I give the floor to our colleagues at FERDI to chair this meeting and this webinar. Thank you, François. And Marie Geourjon, co-responsible for the fiscal program at FERDI. And I will be glad to bring my contribution to this webinar, during which we will have 6 presentations. 2 introductory presentations, general presentations, and then we will have 4 speakers from 4 countries who will give us some feedback on the way they use these reports on fiscal spending. The first will be done by Tais, Chartouni, Rodrigues, who will remind us the importance of mobilizing tax revenue for funding, for public funding, especially for the international community, and the importance of tax revenue. Tais, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tous et à toutes.
Hello, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Thanks, FERDI, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you today. On behalf of the Addis Tax Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder partnership embedded in the United Nations Financing for Development process. So ATI brings together countries and organizations around a shared vision to build tax systems that work for people and advance the sustainable development goals. ATI, as well as the outcomes of the 4th Financing for Development Conference, recognized that DRM is central to sustainable development finance. It enables countries to reduce dependence on external financing and debt, provides predictable and domestically owned resources for countries to finance their own development, social and economic priorities, while enabling countries also to strengthen accountability in the social contract between state and its citizens. The current global context, of course, also reinforces the importance of DRM. We see tight fiscal space, high debt burdens, constraints in international financing, and on the other hand, increasing financing needs for climate action, infrastructure, health, education, etc. So in this context, why tax expenditures matter? So tax expenditures, exemptions, deductions, credits, preferential rates, and different types of special regimes are widely used worldwide as fiscal policy tools. They can indeed be very important to support investment, social objectives, and economic transformation. However, the problem is that they're often poorly governed, also weakly scrutinized, and rarely reviewed on a systemic basis, and often they do not meet their intended objectives. So in this context, we see also data from the GTAD, the Global Tax Expenditure Database, how representative these tax expenditures are, around 3.7% of global GDP, roughly 23% of total tax revenue, which is very significant. Therefore, we also see that tax expenditure reform provides an opportunity for countries to increase fiscal space, strengthen DRM, and effectively fund their development priorities. This concern and this perspective is also reflected in the current political and international debates. As I mentioned, the Compromiso de Sevilla, the outcome of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, for the first time had a specific commitment related to tax expenditures, so encouraging countries to enhance oversight and management of tax expenditures, including through transparent tax expenditures reporting. Also, ATI launched its new declaration called Civil Declaration on DRM. In Civil, and among its actions, it also emphasized the importance of greater transparency and better reporting, but an emphasis also on strengthening countries' capacity to evaluate tax expenditure and rationalize them. So in terms of these challenges, despite its potential of tax expenditures reform, removing ineffective and harmful tax expenditures, this is often difficult. Our experiences with countries is, of course, you have political economy constraints. A key obstacle, on the other hand, is often the lack of reliable and comparable information on fiscal costs, distributional impacts, and overall cost-benefit outcomes. Without this solid data, the policy debates remain difficult. Reforms also face strong resistance within the country and the different government bodies. So that's why ATI has been supporting countries through peer learning and capacity building to strengthen governance frameworks, improve estimation methods, and also enhance overall T reporting and monitoring and evaluation. We see a lot of progress, so countries are having these efforts have been yielding results with a growing number of ATI partner countries now producing tax expenditures reports. And our experience also show that the report is the first step, the first report. The initial reports are often limited in terms of the set of taxes and expenditures, and the subsequent ones become more comprehensive, more methodologically robust, and they form the basis for evaluation and rationalization. At the same time, we see a lot of remaining challenges in terms of conducting evaluations, embedding frameworks and requirements for both ex ante and ex post evaluation of tax expenditures. And this is an area where we're aiming to concentrate our efforts in the coming years, assisting our partner countries to improve, after all, the rationalization and reform of TEs. So to conclude, I think the message is that publishing tax expenditures is not an end on itself, but a foundational step for better governance, transparency, and effective reform. And I look forward to hearing more about other panelists or country experiences in this regard. And ATI remains committed to this agenda with the goal of supporting countries strengthening DRM and their development financing agenda. So yeah, that's it in short, and back to you, Anne-Marie. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Tais, d'avoir respecté les.
Thank you very much, Tais, for staying within the time constraints and for asking all of the important questions. This is a very exhaustive context of everything we have to discuss. The second presentation will be a presentation by FERDI because we tried to use the GTAD data on fiscal spending to give you an idea of the publication of reports on fiscal spending, tax spending in Africa, to better understand where countries are, who has published, who hasn't published, and since how long, And I now give the floor to Gaël, who will present a few results that will allow us to find out what's the situation, including in the countries we've invited here. Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. I will now give you an overview of spending of tax reports in Africa. Our review is based on the Global Tax Expenditure Database, which is produced jointly by the CEP and the German IDOS. It uses publicly available data. It covers 116 countries and 35 African countries, which have published at least one tax report between 2005 and 2024. And so we will be looking at three key metrics. The first year of publication of reports, how regularly reports are produced, and the quality of the reports of previous years. So concerning first year of publication, we can see progress in fiscal reporting in African countries, with 33 countries that distinguish themselves. They've published their first report between 2025 and 2024. So the pioneers were Morocco and Lesotho. Then there are intermediate countries that published their first report between 2012 and 2018. And then more recent countries, such as Togo and Chad. In 2024, 35 countries out of 54 have published at least one tax report. The first step is to publish a report on tax spending. The second step is to do this on a regular basis. And this is an indicator of the maturity of the administrative process. This must be interpreted prudently because the scope of the fiscal spending that's been reported each year isn't necessarily the same every year. This metric has allowed us to define a criteria to determine whether a country is publishing regularly or irregularly. A country is not considered to be publishing regularly if it doesn't output a report at least once every 2 years. And here we can see regular and irregular countries. So, for instance, Morocco and South Africa are good examples. There are also countries that publish very irregularly, such as Senegal and Mauritius. The last analysis we published uses both of these metrics, and this has allowed us to distinguish 6 country profiles. Countries that have been publishing regularly for a long time, so Morocco, South Africa, Tanzania. Countries that have been publishing for a long time but irregularly. Countries that have been publishing since a medium amount of time and publish regularly or irregularly. And finally, countries that have begun publishing recently. And then we can also see which ones publish regularly and which publish irregularly. What is the conclusion of this analysis? We can see a major progress in Africa because 35 African countries have published at least one report on tax spending between 2025 and 2024. But this remains a sporadic effort. even though the majority of new countries do it in a regular basis. And this provides good tools for policy steering and allows African countries to better mobilize their internal resources. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Gaël, for this presentation. We understand that this mapping only relies on published reports. It has nothing to do with the quality of reports on fiscal spending, because in some cases, it can be done with a very small scope, with a lot of improvements left to do, no impact studies, recommendations or not, rationalization or not. So the idea is really not today to look at what's inside the reports. We just want to see who is publishing a report at all. So after going through this map of different African countries, we wanted to ask 4 of these to intervene, and we're glad that they did, because this will give us a sample depending on the identified categories. The first country which will be speaking is Morocco, because it's one of the oldest countries with regular reports. Then there's Morocco, who's been publishing for some time with regular reports. Guinea, with old publications, but reports that are not on a regular basis. And finally, we'll have Togo, that has been publishing recently, begun publishing recently, and hasn't published for 2 years. So they were categorized as irregular, but it's not quite that significant when they've only started a very short time ago. So first, I'll give the floor to the representative of Morocco, Sir Abderrahim Mezroui, responsible of the data team at the General Directorate for Taxes in Morocco, and he will give us a feedback on his country's experience, which is the oldest country in Africa in terms of publishing for tax spending in Africa. Thank you all. I am glad to be here. I'm responsible for the data team within the DGI. Today we have a core question. What does the regular publication of reports on tax spending allow us to do? Before answering this very relevant question, first of all, I would like to thank the team of the FERDI Research Initiative for this time together, this time to think. What does the regular publishing of reports on tax spending allow us to do? It's allow us to make major progress institutionally, budgetarily, and also strategically. Let's start by institutionally. We are talking about transparency and the appropriation of the concept. Published continuously since 2005 and always appended to the yearly finance project law. This has allowed us to have more transparency. The concept of fiscal spending, of tax spending, is regularly present in Moroccan newspapers, and this is very important. Today, this concept is fully appropriated by members of parliament, by decision makers, and by the media. This report has become a reference document for the public spending debate. I often insist at the parliamentary finance session, I always insist on the importance of this concept, and I'm satisfied to say it's always debated. The second major benefit is strategic. It's a paradigm shift for public policies. The report has allowed us to move public doctrine forward, and in this context, Our new fiscal law published in 2021 has clearly enshrined the principle of rationalizing public spending, giving priority to direct subsidies, direct public subsidies. And this gives us two hands-on examples of this paradigm shift with a new charter published in 2022, which enshrines the concept of a subsidy to investment. So right now we're not talking about tax incentives. We're talking about investment premiums, investment subsidies. And there are several categories, several articles which list these. There's the territorial premium, sectorial premium. There's a whole series of categories. The second example is what we've introduced in our 2024 finance law, a direct aid for housing, which comes to replace an existing fiscal spending, which used to cost 2.5 billion dirhams to the state budget, so 0.15 of our GDP, which is not negligible. The third major advancement, and this is budgetary, it's a direct impact on fiscal spending. Our 2021 tax law has introduced two major fiscal reforms. First, the reform of IS. This reform has allowed us to lower tax spending linked to IS, by almost 60%, and this has allowed us to remove 14 sources of spending. For the reform of VAT in the 2024 law, this has allowed us to reduce tax spending connected to VAT by 28%, 28.3%. And this has allowed us to delete 24 sources of spending. The weight of fiscal spending in the GDP has gone from 2.4% before reforms down to 1.4% after reform. So we've gained a whole 1% of our GDP. To conclude, the transparency process initiated by this regular reporting in my office, there's actually it's actually shown on the wall how regularly we publish. This regular publication of the report has anchored the principle in public debate of generating a change in order to better steer our public spending and our budget. Unfortunately, despite these advancements, it is still crucial to recognize that some challenges have not yet been overcome. The first challenge is that we need to reinforce analysis, and this has been mentioned. We need to talk about the socioeconomic aspects to go beyond simply numbers. And the second challenge, which we still have to take care of, is to secure the very concept of fiscal spending with a stabilized definition and one that is defined by law. We have a reference system now, but the concept is not stable, and it's very difficult for us to stabilize things. Nevertheless, Morocco has historic depth for data and currently has a mature institutional framework, and now it has expertise when it comes to AI technologies, which allows us to produce a new generation of meaningfulness around fiscal spending. We must move towards a new generation of meaning around the concept of fiscal spending. This renewed approach in service of policymakers, of members of parliaments, is a strategic lever in order to move public policies forward with determination. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this feedback from Morocco. We can see that it was very beneficial and has generated many changes. We will now ask Ms. Tantely Ravelomanana, who is a coordinator for the fiscal policy unit in Madagascar, to give us the feedback for her country. It's a country that has been publishing started publishing more recently, but is also publishing on a regular basis.
Merci beaucoup, Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for giving me the floor. I am Tantely Ravelomanana, and I've been working within the fiscal policy, the tax policy unit, and I'm going to present today the experience of Madagascar in terms of publishing reports on tax spending. But first, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity that you have given me to present today and to share with a very experienced and very diverse audience. So concerning Madagascar, the publication of reports for fiscal spending, which has been done since 2015, is done within the context of an improvement of the transparency of budget management. Since 2021, we've been publishing as an addendum to our finance law. So it's addendum 17. So we can see this is the link of the most recent report on fiscal spending for 2024. What are the use cases for these reports? What are they used for? What are the effects and the impacts? We have direct effects and we have indirect effects of the publication of these reports. As a direct effect, we've mentioned the increased awareness around the notion of tax spending. It's a bit like what we've heard about in Morocco, in the media, in social networks, everywhere, in the public institutions, and even in private institutions. We can see that the notion of fiscal spending is being used more and more. And this is being connected to budgetary spending, and people used to confuse both of them because both were called spending. So now people understand that there's a difference between tax spending and budgetary spending. There's also an increased awareness concerning reporting, the importance of reporting on this, because people see the loss of tax income, which is indirect, because of poorly planned incentives. As a final direct effect, there's the rationalization of incentives, which are considered to be ineffective, through the evaluation, distributional evaluations, or impact studies. So there's an attempt to rationalize those measures which are considered to be ineffective. So this is a small report. Since 2015, we've been publishing. Since then, we've had about 10 reports and an evolution in the number of fiscal spending that has been reported on. So there might be large gaps, especially when it comes to methodology. But we can also see that apart from some measures that were inserted, There's also those that have been deleted or modified.
So you can see in 2023, for example, there were 8 measures that were changed or removed. So the indirect impact of these reports is that they can be used as tools for policy decisions for ministers or even higher. And they're also the object of discussions amongst a number of stakeholders in the country, public administrations, the private sectors, civil society, as well as technical and financial partners. I can give you some examples. Elements that are published in these reports are, for example, what are being negotiated for some the funding of PTF. And so it's a way of determining which measures could be rationalized and made more effective and more efficient. It's also a way to improve the government's negotiating position, because it's a way to apply pressure economically or politically, for example, on private companies who would like to be exempt from certain taxes. So it's a tool that's always useful, and the government is provided with a very useful tool to argue their position in the face of other stakeholders. With the publication of these reports, we realize the necessity to assess the implementation of incentives beforehand and afterwards. So this has now been voted into law, and it entered into force in 2025, making it mandatory to request the opinion of the ministry when deciding to provide tax and customs exemptions or tax and customs incentives. So these measures have to be assessed every 3 years to see if they really are having the planned for impact. Are they meeting their objectives? Here are some excerpts from the law for the conditions to adopt and to assess these tax incentives, those that are already in force or which plan to be implemented, upon what conditions, and more specifically, the result of these assessments must be published in the annual report on tax expenditures as an annex. So this is an exercise which is quite difficult, publishing these data. First of all, assessing tax expenditures is difficult, and then publishing these results is another kettle of fish altogether. So some perspectives for the future. So first of all, this is a highly technical report, so it's hard to make it accessible to all, to a broader public. So we currently need to improve our economic assessments to truly be able to rationalize tax expenditures and also to improve our coverage of people who understand this notion of tax expenditures. We also need more work here. So I will stop here, but I will be happy to answer all questions during the Q&A session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tantely, for your presentation. We will now hear our representative from Guinea, who is the head of operational monitoring unit of the Togolese Revenue Office, tax policy unit in, Chief Executive Officer, Strategy and Development Office, Administrative Budget in Guinea. So first of all, our Bureau of Strategy and Development now belongs to the Ministry of the Economy, Finance, and the Budget. It's changed just a few days ago. As I was saying, within our department, we have the unity devoted to tax policy, which assesses tax expenditures amongst other tasks. This is the unit that works with the tax services, with the budgets, with customs, carrying out this technical work. Last time this report was published, that was in 2018. There was a gap of a few years because the department was being overhauled. I arrived a year and a half ago, and the next report on tax expenditures was published in 2023. So it's in the law that it requires that this be annexed to the finance law, which is then transmitted to the National Assembly. Once the report on tax expenditures has been drafted, it is then validated in-house. We organize a workshop for this where all stakeholders come together to provide the technical validation of the report. After that, it is published, shared with all stakeholders, including the National Assembly. And from then, every year we have had a report. And we are currently validating this year's report, and it will be shared with the external stakeholders soon, and then will be published. So what lessons have we learned from publishing these reports? We've had a number of experiences. First of all, it highlights the importance of tax expenditure and tax exemptions, for example, to companies. And for example, in the mining sector, this is most often where we have tax exemptions, and there are other measures in place, put in place by the government to favor the purchasing power of households. So this is a loss of revenue. Taxes, which have the most exemptions, were those where they were brought in the most revenue. For example, VAT represented about 15% of tax revenues, so about 7% of GDP, $350 million. So everybody saw how considerable this was, and the National Assembly insisted that we had to rationalize tax expenditures. So that is underway, and we're currently assessing the impact of tax expenditures so that we can identify what's most relevant and do away with those which are the least relevant. So we will have a rationalization committee. And this is the case in most countries already, because tax exemptions are not only up to the Ministry of Finances, it's other ministries can provide these. For example, the Ministry of Industry, and then also the revenues, the Internal Revenue Services also notes these tax exemptions. And so we're currently setting up a committee of rationalization to bring together all stakeholders to make this process more fluid and to make them more rational. And then once the reports were published, we legislated on it in 2025, saying that no decisions as to tax exemptions could be made without the authorization from the ministry. This has made it possible to reduce the number of exemptions. In addition, more specifically for the mining sector, demanded that all conventions which are expiring will not be renewed. And this also has to do with corporate tax. A lot of these was the companies that had the highest number of exemptions. And this situation has been in play for several decades. And of course, this has had a huge impact on tax revenues. Currently, the report on tax expenditures for 2024, which will soon be published, which will coincide with setting up our rationalization committee. And then little by little, we will be doing away with the least efficient loopholes. First of all, when we draft these reports, we access data, which needs to be periodical and reliable, but that can be difficult. But it's a problem that we're solving because we're finalizing our system. And now we have a single system used by the tax revenue department and outside stakeholders, making it easier to share information amongst all stakeholders and make publications more regular around tax expenditures. So I will stop here. If there's anything I haven't covered, I'm delighted to answer any requests for further information. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll see two questions afterwards, but let's finish with our panelists first. I now give the floor to Togo with a presentation by Mr. Soumanou, who's head of the Operational Monitoring Unit of the Togolese Revenue Office, the Tax Policy Unit in Togo. And to share the experience of a unit which has only recently started publishing reports. The Togo is one of the countries that has been publishing these reports for the least amount of time. Soumanou, Moutala, you have the floor. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. We can see it, but it's not full. There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much. It's an honor to share with you the experience of Togo in publishing reports on the tax expenditures. So here's the outline of my presentation. First of all, I wish to thank FERDI for this opportunity to share the experience of Togo in this area and what we have been doing in terms of publishing reports on tax expenditures. The goal in publishing these reports for Togo, first of all, is to actually catch up with other countries, and it's very recent for us. 2021 was the first year in carrying out this exercise. So we have reports, so that we had reports of 2019, 2021. And now there have been reforms making it possible to continue publishing these reports on a more regular basis. So we set up this unit that I work for, which is now operational. So the operational monitoring unit, so that we can coordinate the activities around publishing these reports on tax expenditures. There's also a committee that was set up to assure this work. And since then, we have regularly been publishing reports around tax expenditures. And of course, everything that has already been said is relevant for us ever since we started publications in 2021. So 2 years later, so it's published in October, 2 years. So the 2024 was published in October of 2025. And that's a document which was appended to the spending law for the following year. So the goal now is to make our work more visible. Thanks to this publication, we saw the same results as what other colleagues have said. It has heightened transparency. People are more aware of the efforts being made by the government to provide support to households, to foster investments and jobs. And we have noted since publication that in daily discourse by politicians and in the media as well, a lot more talk around tax expenditures. So this is very interesting. And this has also improved governance, because now we know how much is allocated to each sector. And this makes it possible to make readjustments if the results are not as expected. And then when we publish this report on tax expenditures, we realize that the goals set out for tax exemptions, if the results are not met, then they can be revised for the following year. So, I wanted to share a few figures. So just a few figures on what we've seen, but I believe that we can come back to this later if necessary. For Togo, the situation is dynamic. Initially, we noted that the perimeter wasn't large enough. So continuing this, we attempt to increase our scope every year. So the perimeter isn't stable yet. And so as you see, there's growth as compared to GDP. Once the perimeter is stabilized, certain things will become easier. So what we tried to highlight here is attempts at rationalization. In 2024, for example, we were able to rationalize part of tax expenditure to the amount of 2.7%. This would represent an increase of 14.5%. So those are the efforts we could make in terms of domestic public resource mobilization. So now in terms of tax exemptions and their impact, we began the exercise, but you know how difficult it is. We can share feedback from this experience with you. And we're also interested in knowing what other countries have done to learn from their experiences. So we have the impact study, and then we have specific conventions or agreements. So there are certain tax exemptions which are provided outside the law, so we are attempting to close those loopholes. But of course, it requires a lot of work. And then COVID measures have now been reduced. So we no longer need to mention those. So to finish my presentation and perspectives for the future, currently in Togo, we have a decree by the Ministry of Finance and Budget, which will make it systematic to have an ex-ante report on tax expenditures before further tax exemptions are provided. The beneficiaries will have to show exactly what the benefits will be for the country. So that is where we stand currently. And first of all, we are reducing tax expenditures, and we salute you for organizing this opportunity to share information on these topics through the presentations. Thank you very much for bringing our country on board. Thank you. Thank you very much for this experience. What I note is that your experience is more recent in assessing the publications reports on tax expenditures. You have noted that so far you are increasing tax expenditures, but it's not necessarily because the budget has increased. It's simply that you are assessing more. It is an exercise which is dynamic, as you said, and this is why it's important to note that originally when a country starts assessing tax expenditures, first of all, there's a sharp increase in the first years because the assessment perimeter evolves with the techniques maturing. So it takes a little bit of time before tax expenditures start coming down again, because you can start rationalizing them, but first you have to take everything into account, which triggers an initial rise. So that is what the problem is in the very first years when you start this type of exercise. It can skew the results. And this is also why it was important to have presentations by countries who have been doing this for a very long time and others who have started much more recently. Because it takes time to improve techniques, and that's why it's important to share our experiences, to have a greater impact on domestic public resource mobilization. Before I open the floor for questions and answers, amongst the panelists, do you have any questions for each other? Amongst the countries who are presenting, perhaps you have questions for the other countries. Because, of course, people are at a variety of stages in their process. So this may have raised questions among the panelists.
Vous n'avez pas de questions les uns?
Are there any?
Si,
yes, I have a question.
Salut Diallo, merci beaucoup.
Oui.
Merci
Salut
à tous les
Diallo.
collègues pour leur
Thank you to
présentation
all
et
the
l'expérience qu'ils ont
colleagues
partagée.
for presenting
Merci
their
Togo
very
des
rich
intervenants
experiences, and thank you to,
d'innovation.
to
J'ai une question
Togo
pour
for
le
their
Togo. En
presentation.
fait,
So I have a
j'ai cru
question for
comprendre
them.
qu'ils ont
I believe
décidé
that
de procéder à
you've
une évaluation ex
decided
ante
to have an
des
ex-ante
des
evaluation
exonérations avant le
of tax
bénéfice
exemptions
pour un
before
contrôle
providing
judiciaire. Je voudrais savoir
further
vraiment, dans
exemptions.
la est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui est désormais opérationnel
Is
et
this
quel
operational
impact
already? And what
serait dans la
impact
pratique qu'ils ont constaté dans le traitement et
has it had
dans l'impact
in
des
practice?
dépenses fiscales?
And what impact has it had on tax expenditures?
Merci.
Thank you.
Monsieur Soumanou, vous voulez répondre?
Would you like to answer right away?
Merci beaucoup.
Yes, thank you very much. So, as far as our experience is concerned, and this is something we have made systematic, but I do have to tell you that to a certain extent, some tax exemptions we do not know about. Because they have to send the file for us to be able to carry out an ex ante assessment. We have received quite a few dossiers with new demands for exemptions. We provide our opinion, but it's not up to us to make the decision. So it's up to the authorities to decide whether to provide the tax exemption or not. It can be necessary given other aspects of the economy. So what I can say is that indeed, for new tax exemptions, we receive a report and we have refused some or provided a negative opinion. For others, we are currently looking for more information because the evaluation is extremely complex. You have to try to see exactly what the impact is. And you have to anticipate these effects to see what will happen with the tax exemption. But experience has shown that there has been a reduction in these exemptions. In any case, we monitor the situation much more closely. And I can say more bilaterally, perhaps, if anyone is interested. Thank you very much. Let me just add something. When you carry out an ex ante study, I imagine you request information on the files, on the requests that have been put in. And that's very interesting for the ex post study, because this means that you've already had contacts with the beneficiaries of these tax exemptions. So here you would have more data available to really assess whether the objectives laid out in the request for the tax exemption were actually met. I think that this undertaking, even though it is complicated and it's not necessarily systematic, having gotten it started is very important already. Are there any further questions for each other? Yes, Tantely, you have a question? Yes, thank you very much, Anne-Marie. I have two questions for our colleague from Morocco. He mentioned that following the publication of these reports, they drafted a charter for investment to provide premiums for investment. Could you give us some more details on these? So on these investment incentives to tell us what they consist of and how do they use artificial intelligence in the framework of assessments or perhaps for the publication on tax expenditures? Thank you. Would you like to respond? Yes. In just a few words, concerning the investment charter, this is a framework law to provide a framework for investments. But there is no link with tax expenditures, except that this law, and this is, when I talked about the change in paradigm, I said that the regular publication of these reports has led to a change in paradigm in public policy. And this was taken into account in the investment charter. There was a former charter from 1995 that with a lot of tax exemptions for tax incentives. And we see that now the paradigm has changed. There are much fewer tax incentives And we have shifted to direct assistance. And as far as new technologies and artificial intelligence are concerned, today in our action plan, we actually have a project devoted to new technologies. We have further use cases with forecasts. We try to challenge with these forecasts using AI. And of course, the same for tax expenditures. We have our classic tools for the assessment, and now we want to challenge those assessments with the classical tools using AI and comparing the results. So, the advantage today is that we have the human capital for this, and so we are starting this experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had a question concerning this about the balance between tax spending and direct subsidies, because it seems that in Morocco, you've chosen to substitute tax spending. You've chosen to substitute direct subsidies to tax spending. You call it a paradigm change. So the question I wanted to ask is, I know that in Morocco you have both of these instruments that are not necessarily use direct subsidies, or not, is not an instrument that's used in other countries. So you use it when it comes to the publication of fiscal spending. Is there a connection between the cost for a certain sector of activity and the cost of tax spending and the amount of direct subsidies that are given to a particular sector, to the same sector? You've talked about housing, for instance. You say that you've replaced tax spending with direct subsidies. Do you have, is there a connection? Or are there two parallel reports with these two instruments that have the same effect, or supposed to have the same effect? You can prefer one to the other, but it's a way to use resources in both cases. Yes, actually, in the project or the draft law for fiscal reform, it's written in the text, as I've said in the presentation today. This law enshrines the principle of the rationalization of fiscal spending, and the rationalization has been done through this incentivization to be more direct, because it's more transparent, quite simply. We want this communication. We do this when it comes to control, to see which companies benefit from subsidies, and we try to bring this closer to their fiscal behavior. But for the time being, it isn't systematic, and we still need to do it. We need to bring this in relation, these two things in relation with one another more systematically. Thank you very much. Were there other questions? We might move on to certain questions that were asked online by certain listeners of this webinar. Any questions? I would just do one comment following the presentation of Madagascar, Guinea, and Togo. When listening to you, we saw that the evaluation of tax spending was done because of the implementation of a tax policy unit. So to evaluate fiscal spending, you need a group of people that comes from different administrations who are regrouped in these fiscal policy units. But I believe that you also have to note the fact that it's an essential condition in many cases to elaborate reports, but it's also a change, a remarkable change, because it will allow us to have a technical structure that allows us to go beyond the evaluation of fiscal spending. What is important, as Togo mentioned, to do an ex ante study when there's fiscal spending, or that allows us to implement these famous impact studies, which are necessary to rationalize efficiently fiscal policy. So the importance of these fiscal policy units, it's also a result in many cases of the evaluation saying we're going to publish a report on fiscal spending. We have to create a fiscal policy unit, and this fiscal policy unit is already a substantial benefit in terms of fiscal policy in order to be able to address other issues. So that was a comment on the benefits of the process itself. Among the questions we've had, a question I've received is, are the evaluation methods identical from one country to the next? I don't really know if it's the goal of this webinar to talk about evaluation methods and steering committees.
Alors, on demande à Madagascar.
We're asking Madagascar, there's a question which is for Madagascar. Could you give a few examples of tax spending that has been evaluated recently in Madagascar? And what was difficult in making these evaluations? Thank you very much for this question. For every evaluation, for every report, there are economic evaluations. This is the second part of the report. Recently, we've done evaluations on fiscal equity for certain products consumed within households. This has allowed us to see that our taxation is a bit regressive in terms of indirect taxation, which is to say that it's often the most well-off households that benefit from these tax cuts. These are usually tax cuts on essential goods, and this has allowed us to identify some essential goods that are mostly benefiting these most wealthy households. And one of my colleagues from Togo said that we simply propose measures of tax policy, but it's really the policymaker that has to decide to take the final decision. So we've proposed rationalizations. Sometimes rationalizations is not complete retaxation. It's usually a modification of either tax rates or the tax base. So we propose changes to the tax rates to policymakers. What often happens is that technical decision makers accept propositions, but when it moves on to the political level, it's more difficult. So it's also really a challenge. I believe it's the same everywhere. It's a real challenge for us, the technical staff, both on the technical level and also on the level of fiscal policies, because sometimes our propositions are well argued, well documented, but unfortunately, they are not supported on a political level. So we do evaluations in terms of the tax equity on essential goods. Thank you. I believe in terms of tax spending and indirect taxation, this is part of the impact studies that are what I would say the most difficult to implement, because it's much more difficult to have access to all the data when you want to look at the impact studies of some other measures, such as direct taxation. Often you don't have the data available to verify if the goals have in fact been met. Before we move on to questions, in Togo, you had asked the question of how regularly you publish reports. And Gaël, who's been working with us on the TED database, would like to add a few things concerning how regularly these reports are made. Gaël? Thank you. So, with the criteria we've defined in the database, it's not a database that has everything in it, because it's not a specifically African database. So for Togo, the data we've had is that the first year of publication was in 2021. There were 2 reports in June and September 2021. And then, since we've said that a country is irregular if it doesn't publish every 2 years, the other publication was in September of 2024 for 2021 to 2023. So it's on the basis of this criteria that we've decided to say which ones publish regularly and which ones don't publish regularly. It's a criteria on the publication of reports and not on the collection of data, if I may explain it that way. Maybe a question for Guinea that has mentioned what they were going to do now that the reports were published. The year 2024 is going to be published. I had a question. What happened after the publication in 2018? Because you had a publication in 2018, and then there was a gap. There was an irregularity in publication, and now you're going to start again. So you talked about what you wanted to do on the basis of this new publication, but after the report of 2018, has there been an effect of the publication of this report in Guinea? Yes, the main effect that we've seen after the publication of the 2018 report is that a committee was implemented that managed the exoneration process. In Guinea, the exemptions have many sources. There's the investment law, there's mining law, there's policy for improving purchasing power. And so the main tool was managed by the Ministry of Industry. Once the 2018 report was made available, we implemented it through another ministry. In 2021, there was a merger of these ministries, and the investment code was implemented with other stakeholders. The Ministry of the Budget, for instance, in a committee of management of exemptions. So the main thing that was implemented after the 2018 report was a modification of the implementation of exemptions. But since the report was published last year, now we're trying to create a rationalization committee to do systematic impact studies to make sure that no measure is taken before the Ministry of Budget validates it to not renew advantages in the mining sector which are expiring. And we all know that impact studies are very difficult because usually the data is not available. So you have to ex ante implement things to make the data available for these analyses of the effects of the measure. Have you anticipated this sort of thing? Is this something that you've started working on? Yes, we've anticipated this difficulty to access data. We have a theoretical database because when it comes to the investment law, there are conditions that companies have to fulfill in order to have access to exemptions. And so within the ministry, there's a database of companies that benefit from these exemptions. And what we are going to do, what we would like to do, is to do inquiries in all of these companies to see the effects that these tax exemptions have had to put them in line with everything that's been made available. That's something we've already anticipated.
Okay, that's good because yes, the theoretical need for data, of course, it's always very clear, but the problem is to be able to set up databases. So thank you very much for your response. We have another question concerning the financing conventions. Well, projects can be carried out without taxes. And so what measures are taken to keep tax expenditure down in executing these projects? You can answer on behalf of Guinea, but obviously this question is for all participants. Well, for Guinea, it's the investment code which lays the basis of what's done. But investors say that they carry out huge investments and so that they can have an investment convention. Sorry. No, sorry, these are conventions for providing direct assistance.
D'accord, ok. Oui, oui. Alors, pour reprendre la question pour que je saisisse mieux de quoi il s'agissait.
Okay, to make sure I understand, can you repeat the question?
Dans les conventions de financement des projets financés par l'aide extérieure,
for the projects funded by external aid, usually these figures are tax-free. So in the decisions taken in these countries, how do you assess the loss of revenues linked to this type of financing? How do you assess the cost? For Guinea, with the Ministry of the Plan, there is a monitoring cell that monitors all of these funding conventions. To give you some figures, in our last report on tax expenditures, outside funding represented 14% of tax expenditures, 13.6% to be more specific. And these are the figures that we monitor. Because if they import equipment, it goes through customs. They say it's tax free. Here's the convention, and so we know exactly how much revenue is lost. So that's it's thanks to these data that we have this information. Would anybody else like to say how they manage these projects which are financed by external aid and the difficulties this can represent in assessing the level of tax revenue this represents? Well, I can share the experience of Morocco. For categorization, first of all, of this type of expenditures, first of all, we don't look at the amount of VAT itself. That's not considered expenditure itself, because it's actually just an accounting mechanism because the VAT is collected and then it's reimbursed. So it's almost like we've provided a loan to the company. And so we only look at what the interest would have been, and so that is what is considered a loss in tax revenues. As far as data are concerned, that's not a problem, because to be able to have this type of tax exemption or favorable regimes, you have to fill out a dossier, and every time a company buys something VAT-free, they have to put in a request for an exemption, and then they have a certificate. All of this is done online. It's electronically. We have a specific system online where they put in their request for a tax exemption, and they get their certificate. And then our data team can explore these data to assess what the amounts are. And it was 1.5 billion for this type of tax expenditures. So tax expenditures for projects financed by external aid. No, this is more generally. These are purchases which are VAT-free, tax-free. No, actually the question by one of the people in the public is, how do you assess tax expenditures linked to projects which are financed by international development aid, where the contracts are tax-free? How do you assess how much tax is lost? Guinea answered saying that they used the data from their systems. But perhaps a question we could ask all of you is, in your report on tax expenditures, some of these reports don't include projects funded by international assistance, with the exception of the fact that the United Nations says that outside funding should be considered tax expenditures, even though it isn't necessarily, because there is a system of compensation for these taxes. But maybe to sum up the question, in your assessment reports of tax expenditures, do you have a heading international funding? So projects which are funded by international aid. Sorry, maybe I can answer for Madagascar. And this is a case where we consider that it's an expense covered by the state. So everything to do with excise rights or taxes on imports for equipment, material being imported. We don't consider that this is tax expenditure in the report, but we can monitor them. At customs, we can extract the exact figures. And since it is covered and paid for by the state, and there is a service within the Ministry of Finance in charge of these expenses being covered, so we can know exactly how much it has cost. But this is not considered in the report in Madagascar. You can assess it, but it's not in the report. Exactly. Yeah, we know what the figure is exactly, but it's not included in the report. Thank you very much. I would like to, well, before I answer that question, the projects funded by external resources for Togo, It's pretty much the same thing as Madagascar. It's not, to date, it's not considered tax expenditures, but within the Treasury, we know what the figures are, because it's usually a state contribution. So rather than, so while the revenue comes in and then it is spent again. And accounts, it's considered that is not considered tax expenditure, but it's, if we have to process it in a specific manner, then we can talk more about that. But otherwise, that is how we do it. So, but to talk about the question of publishing these reports, I don't know if you could provide me with more information on how you can improve visibility. We publish our report on our country's website, but maybe we should do it on more specific sites to have better visibility. Or where do you go for your information? As far as we're concerned, as soon as the reports are finalized, we publish them on the national website. So for reports, they're available on the website of the Ministry of Finance. They can be downloaded very easily so that you can analyze it more easily. On our end, the data we have aren't exhaustive. So there can be big gaps in our data. And that's why for some countries, such as Togo, who have just started to publish recently, well, they can automatize this in a certain way. But there was an analysis carried out by G7 saying that Togo was amongst the countries that published these reports regularly. But it all depends on the classification, which doesn't actually isn't very important. What's important is that your reports be published on the official websites of your government and that they be accessible, publicly accessible. No. Projects funded by external aid, it's considered income which is credited and then spent at the same time. It's important to know that it should be assessed. And is it really tax expenditure or not? What's important is to know exactly how much it costs countries. If they cover the costs, it's important to know. And this is also a way of avoiding all abuses. Because since the conventions are signed tax-free, you don't know if, rather than waiving fees on 100 importations, then it's actually 150. This can lead to fraud. But at least this way, you have some idea of what the sums are, and you can monitor these transactions more closely. I don't know if there are any other questions amongst yourselves. I don't see any more in the chat. Amongst panelists, are there any further questions for each other? Maybe it would be useful by way of a conclusion for our webinar to ask Tais, who has a more global vision. So on behalf of the ATI, have you learned anything? Was it fruitful for you? What have you thought of our exchanges? Is it make it possible for you to have a better idea of what the current situation is, and you have a better idea of everything that remains to be done in this area to truly benefit from all of the efforts that have been put in by African countries. As we saw, 35 countries have published an assessment report of tax expenditures to date. So we have noted that considerable progress. But what remains to be done to capitalize even more on this huge effort?
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. It's a very rich discussion and very interesting to hear the experiences from the countries. I think there's a lot we can learn from their experiences in terms of how the reports have been informing the public debate in the media with the different government bodies. And that's exactly what the reports are supposed to do and inform also the assessments and evaluations. Also, I think it's very interesting to hear the challenges the countries face in terms of collecting data, what kind of evaluations have been successfully carried out and which ones have not. So I think that's something we can definitely build on in terms of sharing further experiences of countries, for example, reforming their tax return forms or collecting more data for this ex-post evaluations that are very important. Also very interesting to hear about experiences in terms of rationalizing tax expenditures. We heard a good interesting examples from the Guinea in terms of the extractive sector, which was very interesting. Also Madagascar embedding this evaluation frameworks into their procedures and putting this as a regular requirement for the government to carry out the evaluations. This is very key. And these are policies that ATI has been encouraging in its member countries. So I would thank you all very much for the very rich discussion. And definitely, I think that's a discussion we should continue. ATI with the partners of the Tax Expenditures Lab that hosts the GTED. And the GTED, by the way, also a very interesting source in terms of looking at the content of the report itself. So we invite you to join meetings of the community of practice that we host online also to continue this discussion. Yeah, so thank you very much, and yeah, happy to continue the exchange.
Merci Thaïs. Est-ce que quelqu'un veut rajouter quelque chose parmi nos panélistes?
Thank you, Thais. Does anyone want to add anything among our panelists? Very well. In that case, thank you all for participating in this exchange. I believe we've all learned a lot. I believe it was very enriching, and it opens up horizons because we can see that we're not at the end of the road yet, and there's still much to do. Mr. Mezroui, did you want to add anything? Yes, I just wanted to add a tiny little thing. I wanted to inform everyone that the 2026 edition will add 2 improvements. First, we will add the number of beneficiaries. So this is inspired by the GTT report. It's a publication that is interested in these issues. And so by inspiring ourselves on this report, we've added this. And the second point is that we've added a time frame to the evaluation 5 years ahead and 5 years behind, so that we have more depth in our evaluations, so that we have more visibility and a dynamic forecast on tax spending. So that will be for our 2026 publication. Well, we can't wait. Oh, it's already available. Yes. Because the publication goes with the 2026 finance law, so it's already available online. Yes. Well, we're going to go look at it. Thank you very much for those details. Does anyone else want to add anything?
Monsieur Soumanou?
Mr. Soumanou?
Non, peut-être que c'est juste une question, je n'ai pas très bien compris. Quel est le rapport qui est disponible pour le Maroc déjà?
I didn't
J'ai pas très
understand
bien
very
compris.
well which report was available for
2026,
Morocco.
le rapport de
2026?
2026 sur l'exercice 2025, j'imagine.
Yes, the report, the
Effectivement, c'est
2026
mieux
report
les
concerning
ce chapitre
2025, I
ne
believe.
comprend pas la loi de
Yes,
finances. Donc, la loi de
every
finances 2026
publication
a été
comes
élaborée pour
with our
2025 et
draft
2025. Et le
budget law.
rapport
So, of course,
accompagnait cette loi de finances
the
2026 qui est
2026
aujourd'hui
report
sur le site du
is
ministère
about
de l'Environnement.
2025, and it is today
Le rapport de
available on the
2024 alors.
ministry. What about the 2024 report? No, the 2025 report.
La loi de finances est établie en
So,
N-1. La loi de finances de 1 est
the
établie en N-1.
the finance law is established for N minus
Oui,
one.
l'année 2025 n'était pas terminée. La loi de,
Yes,
bon,
but
les
isn't
dépenses
2025
2024.
concluded?
ce sont les dépenses fiscales de 2024 qui devaient être disponibles.
So
Non,
it's
parce
the
que
fiscal
d'autres, la
spending
logique
of
de notre
2025,
c'est que
2024 that
nous
should be
établissons
available.
les dépenses
No, because
2025 en
our
estimant les
logic
mois restants.
is
Et
that
c'est
we
l'année
establish
prochaine qu'on
the
affiche
spending
les
for
données
2025
Mais on estime
by
en 2025,
evaluating, by
on
estimating, by
considère les mois
forecasting
réels
the last
et
few
on
months.
estime les mois restants.
And then
Oui.
we
Voilà,
complete
c'est
it when
super.
we have the data.
OK.
Oh, very well. Thank you very much.
Merci pour cette
Merci.
précision, tout à fait.
Thank you for these final details,
Bon,
which
cette
were
fois-ci, je
useful.
crois qu'on peut
I believe
clôturer
that
ce
we may
webinaire.
now
Merci
conclude
pour
this
cette discussion,
webinar.
je vous en remercie.
There were many
Merci de votre
conversations. Thank you
disponibilité
very much for your
et bonne fin de
availability
journée.
and have an excellent day.
Merci beaucoup.
C'est
Merci, au revoir.